Vidya Dehejia. Let's give them a big round of applause.
It's a great pleasure to introduce to you James McConnachie. He studied at Jesus College, Oxford, and English literature, and he got a double first in English. No, not surprising to me once I read his book, which is as fluent and easy a read as possible, beautifully put together. The book is, of course, the story of the Kama Sutra. And I guess most of us, or many of us, know that the Kama Sutra was written by a gentleman whose name is Vatsyayana. His whole life story remains a mystery to us. And we also know that it was probably written around the year 300 AD. And in his book, James takes us, he moves us between the 3rd century aristocratic, luxurious, courtly life of India and the 19th century, the colonial exploration of this text, which then became accessible to all of us. James has quoted from the most standard version, the recent version of the Kama Sutra translation, which is by Wendy Doniger and Sudhir Kakkar. And he quotes it as the opening, or is it the ending of each of the chapters?
I used different translations for each chapter, but predominantly that one because it's so very good.
Right. I wonder whether you would like to tell us any of the surprises that came your way as you started working through this material?
Yes, absolutely. It was an incredibly surprising book to research. And it's exactly that which attracted me to it, because it is a book that is staggeringly misrepresented. Actually, let me begin by, if I may, asking a question to the audience. How many people here, just so I know, have read the Kama Sutra? Okay, a few hands, incredibly few. How many people have heard of the Kama Sutra? Okay, it illustrates the point perfectly. The question for me is why, of all the incredibly rich heritage of ancient India, the Sanskrit scientific heritage, why has this one book gone global? Why, of all the possible texts that have survived for 2,000 and more years, is this one universally recognized? There's a very simple answer to that, which is a three-letter answer, which is that it's about sex. Of course, but there's a much more interesting answer, and it's what Vidya referred to, which is that there are many things that are surprising about it. I don't know exactly what you know about the book, but I imagine you would expect that it was illustrated. Would that be broadly true? There's someone shaking his head. You see, I'm in India. I have a more sophisticated knowledge of the subject. This book was never illustrated until the 20th century. In fact, until late in the 20th century. That's the first surprise to me. The second was, and it has a Jaipur connection actually, that one of the only surviving manuscripts by the 19th century, and there were very few, certainly less than a dozen, possibly only 6 or 7, was found in Jaipur. And in fact, the scholar who first published and printed the Kama Sutra was a Pandit from Jaipur as well. So there is a home connection with the text, which is gratifying being here talking about it. The really controversial surprise of the 7 I was going to spring you, this is number 3, is I've heard a lot during this talk about kind of apologizing for the West. Oh yeah, we've been ignoring Asiatic, Indian cultures, our focus is always on Europe, you know, we're really sorry, we're trying to get it right now. And I'm actually going to fight back against that and say something which might be controversial, which is that the survival of the Kama Sutra is almost entirely dependent on 2 British Victorian men. Again, the accusations made against Victorian England as having been the thing that not only killed sex in Europe,
but kill sex in India. We hear this all the time. You know, everything that's gone wrong with Indian sexual culture, everything that's taken us away from this tradition is the fault of the Victorians. Well, in this particular case, there was a counter-current in Victorian England, which was really the first stirrings of an openness about sexual culture. So there is always a nuance to the story. Of course, it is also true, a lot of what they say about Victorian sexual culture, but it was two Victorian men who kept it alive, and I'll tell you more about that, I hope, shortly. Another surprise is that you hear all the time, yes, Kama Sutra, Kama Sutra. It's not really a dirty book, is it? It's really a sacred text. Total nonsense. There's almost nothing sacred about this book at all. Written in the 3rd century, it describes in utterly secular, sexual, joyous, hedonistic detail the life of a man about town in ancient India. Okay, at the beginning, the author who says, I'm a very serious scholar, you know, this is an important subject, and he puts it in the context of the Trivarga. So he says, you know, okay, Dharma is very important, Artha very important, Moksha, of course, Karma equally important, but karma is a part, it is a mutual part of this, paths in life. And then, after that point, he says absolutely nothing about dharma, artha, or indeed moksha. It is all karma, 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 all the way to the end. So that was a surprise to me and to many people. Another surprise is that it's famous for having been translated by the explorer Richard Burton. He didn't do any of it. Well, he sexed up the dossier, if I can use that expression a bit, for being printed in England. But the work was done by an entirely obscure Indian civil servant, British Indian civil servant in Bombay, and before him by a man who's almost completely obscure, a pundit from Gujarat called Bhagwanlal Indraji, who is just about known. There's a man working in Bombay on his biography now, and there's an incredible capital in the British Museum which was found by Indraji. If you go there, you can just see his name written there. He was a servant to scholars. He was employed by Indian antiquarians and by British antiquarians to go around all over India looking for coins, untangling rock inscriptions, going to archaeological digs, and at a very strange moment in his life, in the 1870s, this Indian civil servant, Foster Fitzgerald Arbuthnot, tapped him on the shoulder and said, would you mind going to have a look for this Kama Sutra book I've heard about? And it was Indraji who rescued the book from the libraries in Jaipur, Benares, Varanasi, and Calcutta. And my last surprise about the book, the 7th surprise, is it is, of course, how did I put it in the book? It's become a synonym for advanced fucking, if you'll excuse the expression. And I use the vulgarity deliberately. What it means, the word means to us, it is positions of outstanding athleticism, of acrobatics, such that we couldn't even possibly attempt to try them today. Of course, it is none of those things. There are not 64 positions in the book at all, which is also something that is said about the book. And many of those positions are surprisingly simple. They exist to manage disparities between the physical size of the man and the woman. The physical size and height, I mean. There are a couple that are a bit crazy that, if you want to ask me about those, we could talk about later. The 64 positions, it turns out, in the book are classic bit of Sanskrit scholarship here, a multiplication of 8 by 8. So there are 64 arts and 64 techniques. There are 64 ways of making love, because he divides the art of making love into 8 kinds. Embracing, I'm going to have to remind myself which they are here. I always get muddled. Embracing, kissing, scratching, biting. The positions themselves, the woman as a man. And each of those is divided into a further 8 categories. Anyone who's read anything of the ancient Indian literature will know very well the habit of multiplication, mathematical multiplication, especially with the number 64. So they were some of the myths that I exploded in the book, that I confronted in myself. What I hadn't expected was to still encounter now a degree of resistance to writing the book. Many of the manuscripts have left India and come and are now in the British Library. In fact, I should say something about that, because there is a curiosity about the Kama Sutra. It is a classic imperial commodity. It is a thing that was born and made in India the raw material. It was then appropriated by the British in the 19th century, shipped overseas, finished, dressed up, added value created to it, printed, given commentaries, forewords, footnotes, all the rest of it, and then sold at vast profit. And in fact, that commodification is something I talk about in the last chapter of the book, which I'd just like to, I'm not going to read to you, but to give you an indication of where we've got from the 3rd century today. I'm going to try and do this as rapidly as possible, so forgive me if it's not entirely intelligible, but the rapidity is part of the point. At the moment, you can buy the modern Kama Sutra, the new Kama Sutra, the essential Kama Sutra, the pocket Kama Sutra, the Cosmo Kama Sutra, everything Kama Sutra, real Kama Sutra, complete Kama Sutra, illustrated Kama Sutra, complete illustrated Kama Sutra. That's a bit better. Little book of the Kama Sutra, bedside Kama Sutra. You can go beyond the Kama Sutra. You can have Kama Sutra for life. Red hot sex the Kama Sutra way. Kama Sutra tango. Bit of Argentinian influence there. Pure Kama Sutra, though everyone really wanted the impure version. You can have the outdoor Kama Sutra, the Kama Sutra for women, the women's Kama Sutra, the French Kama Sutra revu et corrigé par les filles. Gay men can have the gay Kama Sutra, the gay man's Kama Sutra, the Kama Sutra of gay sex. There is a lesbian Kama Sutra, and there is even a Kama Sutra for one. And I'm sure since I wrote that, there have been even more. There is also, thank you. You can also buy not less than 2 editions of the Kama Sutra in pop-up, although, as Wendy Doniger and Sudhir Kakar pointed out, it doesn't really capitalize on the obvious opportunity for pop-up. It's a shame. So that's what's happened to the Kama Sutra. And kind of my question writing the book was, how did we get from an ancient text within a scholarly tradition in the 3rd century to that place? And what was the story to what happened? And really my interest was in books as living things. I mean, you're all readers, you're all lovers of books, and I think many of us feel that a book has a life, and especially with a book with a life as long as the Kama Sutra, which has had so many different episodes. You know, it has its birth, its adolescence, it's shipped off overseas, it's used, it's bandied about, it's put on different political stages, it's used as a feminist manual, it's used to push gay rights, it's used as an anthropological text, it's used as pornography, of course, enormously. Although those of you, the very few of you who put your hands up, will find that it's slightly disappointing as pornography. It's possibly the only thing that is disappointing about a very wonderful and serious book. So what happened? And what is the Kama Sutra now? Is it the Kama Sutra as it was in the 3rd century, or has it become a tracer of culture, of the relations between the West and India, looked at through the lens of our mutually adapting attitudes towards sex? And that's really what I was interested in. Thank you.
Many questions that I'd like to raise with you, but perhaps first putting Kama as the god of love into the context of the Shiva story. May I just go into that one? There's this tremendous tension between eroticism on the one hand and asceticism on the other. Many of you in the audience will know the story, but I think it bears repeating in this context, that Shiva, God Shiva, was meditating, and he needed to marry Parvati because they needed somebody to, a son born of Shiva, to destroy a group of demons. And so Kama is sent, and Kama, with his bow and arrow, shoots Shiva. Shiva's eyes open, he sees Parvati, he falls in love with her. But in response, what does Shiva do? He opens the 3rd eye in his forehead and burns Kama to death. So the god of love is destroyed, he's ashes. He's then brought back because his wife comes and appeals to Shiva. So there has been this sort of tension between eroticism and asceticism, and they're both combined in the personage of Shiva. That's just a little bit of background to sort of think about Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha in the context of the religious background or the mythical background.
And if I can respond to that, I think that tension, that double edge, runs all the way through. The question I would often be asked is, you know, whose fault is the Indian Penal Code? You know, is this a British imposition? Is it something authentic? And the answer is, of course, that this double attitude to sex and sexuality is present from the absolute beginning in the earliest mythological texts. And in the person of Shiva, I mean, there is the story of how he burns karma. There is, of course, the story where he becomes the universal lingam, stretching right from through the universe, which is, of course, a symbol of potency. It's not simple sex, but nevertheless, Shiva embodies this
yes,
double.
Yes. Absolutely. I think it would be interesting if you spoke to the audience about the fact that, yes, the text is addressed to men, but yes, at the same time, the woman and her pleasure and her role is also there very much in the text.
Yes, absolutely. So the text describes the lifestyle of a man about town, a pretty louche man about town. It describes how he dresses himself, how he comports himself, but mostly it describes his relations with different kinds of women. So with young women who he might want to marry and how he might want to marry them, with his wife, if he's married, with other men's wives, if he wants to have sex with other men's wives, and with courtesans, with prostitutes as well. So there is no doubt that the book objectifies women. I think to try and reclaim it as a feminist foundational text is really stretching it. But, and actually this, you've picked on, I think, the most important aspect of the book. I mean, everyone who writes about sex always tries to turn it into a mission. I've discovered this. It's inevitable. But there is something about this book which is distinctive and unique. And the British who first encountered it in India seized on it. And they seized on it not just because it was shocking, not just because it was amazingly ancient, but also because it showed women in a different way. Now, Richard Burton, the explorer who just failed to find the source of the Nile, went to Mecca in disguise, got a spear through his cheek. If you don't know about him, he's got the most outrageously wonderful life. And he was an outrageous man who wanted to be outrageous. So he used the Kama Sutra as part of his general provocation of British society. But he had a strong purpose. He thought that British women were being sexually abused, effectively, on a routine basis. He thought that the ignorance in which British women were kept about sex was an act of aggression against women. And so for him, and he writes about this very explicitly, to show Britain a text from another culture in which women are actively sexual, when women have desire and express their desire, was a way of slapping the face of conservative British culture and saying, you think you're superior, but look, here's a tradition which has got something right, which you've had wrong for about 2,000 years.
And would you like to, give us an example?
Yeah. There's a passage which is utterly glorious. I'll have to go and fetch my copy. Let me just find it for you. So this is one of the excerpts from the original text. This is in Wendy Doniger and Sudhir Kagar's translation. Two of the positions described, the woman performs a very active role and a very dramatic role as well. It's interesting, there's a strong relation between treatises on dance in Sanskrit. So take, for instance, the position known as the twining vine. Now, in there, the woman, as a vine twines around a great damar tree, so she twines around him and bends his face down to her to kiss him. She's in charge at that point. In climbing the tree, she rests one of her feet on her lover's foot and the other on his thigh. Okay, it takes a bit of doing, but it's possible. And, trust me, and acts as if he were climbing his body in order to claim a kiss. But when the woman plays the man's part, and it does put it in terms of this being like a man, and yet, she pretends to be unable to bear it, and all the while she uses, according to her imagination, the cries of the dove, cuckoo, green pigeon, parrot, bee, nightingale, goose, duck, and partridge, which is pretty exceptional skill set, I think, really, for any woman uttering the cries of love. But it shows the sophistication of sexual culture at the time, I think.
And may I go to that same text and quote another passage? Scholars say, since females cannot grasp texts, it is useless to teach women this text. But Vatsyayana says, women understand the practice, and the practice is based on the text. This applies beyond the specific subject of the Kama Sutra. For throughout the world, as all subjects, there are only a few people who know the text, but the practice is within the range of everyone. Interesting that practice, and that women know the practice, and therefore they should be reading this text. It talks about how women should learn the techniques of the text from someone they trust. And it says, the people qualified to teach a virgin are a foster sister who grew up with her and has already made love with a man, or a girlfriend who has had the same experience and with whom she can converse without risk, one of her mother's sisters who is her age, an old servant woman who is trusted and can take that aunt's place, a female renunciant with whom she has previously been intimate, tricky one that, and her own sister, if that sister takes her into confidence about her own lovemaking. So women are supposed to be taught at a certain stage about the art of love, which is very interesting. It also, somewhere else, tells the young man who has just married this young girl, they don't know each other, right? That he should not try and make love to her for at least 3 nights, that the first 3 nights should be spent in winning her confidence and getting her to trust him. So it's got some very interesting things about women. It is about the Nagarika, that man about town, but...
And those passages you quote, they illustrate perfectly the attitude towards women and the consideration for women. They also illustrate one of the things which makes the book so excellent, and I think one of the reasons it survived is it's fundamentally an extremely interesting and useful book, is its pragmatism. I mean, is that not true, that you would not leave your daughter's sexual education in the hands of a 15-year-old boy she starts going out with? I mean, that's frankly what we've left it to happen. People fumbling in the dark. It's probably the worst possible course of action you could take. I mean, it seems to me, I mean, without pushing an agenda here, that's a deeply pragmatic answer.
Absolutely. I think there's other sections which you might like to talk about, particularly the difference between... Vajrayana and the Kama Sutra asks you to cultivate the erotic, and it contrasts that with raw sexuality, that they are 2 completely different things. And perhaps you'd like to address that issue?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Cultivation is the point. And again, to drag it back to my perspective from the West, this was what, again, struck the Burton and Arbuthnot were discovering the text for themselves, was the exquisite level of sophistication, cultivation, that far from sex being something which had to be pushed aside, to be a complete man, a gentleman, and a complete woman, this was a necessary art for you to master. You would be, the original text says you should be ashamed in company if you do not know how to do these things, which I think is something that we just would never imagine, that the shame being turned completely on its head from what we talk about in terms of shame, sexual shame now, and the sheer artistry. I mean, I mentioned, this is something Vidya knows much more about than me, but I mentioned the connections with other arts, with drama, and certainly dance. Many of the postures in the classical treatises on dance have strong relations with the Kama Sutra. Certainly there were cross currents there. And of course, dance, music, theatre have often been places of relative sexual liberality. But they're equally a place of cultivation where you turn behaviour into an art.
Absolutely. And in that context, of course, there are supposed to be these 64 arts. Again, this magical number 8 by 8. but it's an interesting list of arts that the cultivated man about town, the gentleman, needs to know. He is expected to be a connoisseur of jewels. I mentioned this first because this is Jaipur, the town of jewels, and it says you must know your emeralds, and a quality stone from a non-quality stone. One of many arts that a gentleman is supposed to know. A whole range of these. Do you want to speak about that?
Yeah, I mean, I have some of them listed here. I mean, some of these are specifically aimed at professional sex workers, courtesans, who, of course, would be expected to have a wider range, perhaps. But they are very broad. Jewels, as you mentioned, cooking. Okay, try that for the feminists. Making glasses sing by rubbing their wet rims, and teaching parrots and minor birds to talk. This is not a world where sex is divorced from the rest of your cultural life. It is an intrinsic part of it. And isn't that not the fundamental message of the Kama Sutra? At the beginning, he says, you know, all these texts, they've all divided it off. They've all made sex something that's different from everything else. But it's simply a part of the bigger life.
Yes, it has a major role to play, and you better learn how to do it well.
Yes, yes. And thinking about your work, Vidya, on temple sculpture in particular, I mean, most famously, Khajuraho, we discuss the mitunas, the interlocking couples, as if they were something exceptional, that they sort of, they're in red, and everything else on the facade of the temple is a different color. They exist in different universes. We discuss them in a different way, but they are simply a part of the whole range. Am I not right?
They are absolutely, and we get embarrassed by them, but as I said perhaps this morning, what do they express? They do express the joy of life, the joy of love, and the joy of sex. They are part of living. You must experience them. There is a particular stage in your life at a particular age where these are central, and you must experience them, and experience them well.
I was told a very funny anecdote yesterday about someone who speaks English and Hindi fluently and was visiting the temples at Khajuraho, and they could hear the guide's Hindi commentary and another guide's English commentary, which were totally different. And the English commentary focused exclusively on the sexual element and said that these were illustrative of the Kama Sutra, which is, of course, well, it is not at all true. And the Hindi guide, Hindi-speaking guide, glossed the sexual sculptures as being about fertility, about good luck, and it was an entirely different, more apologetic approach. And of course, neither has more merit than the other.
Yeah. Talking about texts and a discovery of a text, I'm going to take you into that in a minute, but the Laws of Manu is one of those texts that's quoted so often in India. And it's interesting that it was not a text of that great importance as far as India was concerned. It just happened that I think it was a British judge in Calcutta who, somebody came up to him, a pundit, and said, I've got this text. And suddenly they translated it, and it became so important, when it actually was not one of those important texts. And we quote it for everything when we talk about the position of women in ancient India, that the woman only exists either as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter, you know. But it's one text taken out of context and given importance that it should never have been given.
Yeah.
The Kama Sutra is not quite like that. No. But would you like to talk about the discovery, or?
I think you've absolutely nailed the central issue there, which is that we can't know, as historians, it's very hard to work out the relative status of texts as they were in the past, because their status grows like a snowball. And it's very hard. You can see who quotes who how much, but still it's quite hard to work out what is more or less significant in which different regions. And it's very hard with the Kama Sutra to know whether this always was a totally naughty, scandalous, provocative, outrageous text. There's a scholar who thinks the entire thing is a piss take. he thinks it's a pastiche of the Arthashastra. I don't think that's right, but it's the same problem with Manu that to what extent do you believe Manu to be representative of the authentic Indian classical ancient attitudes to sex any more than the Kama Sutra is? But in order to know that, you have to have the text visible. And just to get back to the discovery, the astonishing thing about this book that is ubiquitous is that it very nearly died. I'm getting back to the life of books here. So the story is that in the 1870s, you could buy widely a number of medieval sex manuals in India in various languages. And one of them, in particular, mentioned the master, Vatsyayana, the Kama Sutra. This is the original source. And these two British men with an interest in things a little bit naughty decided it would be quite fun and interesting to find out what this master actually said. So they employed Pandit Bhagwanlal Indrajit to go looking for the text. And Indrajit could only find 4, of which 2 were completely corrupt and almost useless. And it's in the context where British scholars, in a very imperialistic way, were rampaging through Sanskrit libraries. There's a description I found of an employee of the British state who was sent off and just filling bags with books and taking them away as swag. And then they'd be gone through and catalogued, again, usually by Indian Sanskrit scholars, and then the Western scholar would kind of sit there and take all the credit. But this was an immense project of recovery of texts, which, as we know, do not survive necessarily that long in India. They have to be copied and recopied. And the only good text that Indrajit could find had been recopied in the 19th century at some point. So presumably if that act of copying hadn't happened, gone. So this entire window on an alternative sexual culture in ancient India could have banged shut pretty tightly if it hadn't been for a couple of pornographic-minded British adventurers.
Did you find it in any way difficult to be working with this material?
Yeah, definitely. As soon as you write about sex, you get typecast. It's the same problem with the temples. Everything gets painted in red. So personally, I have surprisingly tricky reactions. My father-in-law, that was quite a tricky one. He sort of said, I'm very glad someone's writing something sensible about this subject. So that was nice. And then in libraries, even now, in the British Library, I had to, like a small child, I had to go up to the counter. You have to collect your book from the counter there anyway. But then I had to give a special slip, which I had to sign out with my name. And then I had to take it over to a special counter where the music librarian sits all the time. Normally, you're just on rows and rows of desks. But this one is right underneath a guy sitting up on a high stool. And I had to read my book under his supervising gaze, which is kind of amazing in the 21st century. And then in the Bodleian Library, I found, by complete lucky break, tip-off, I found the original, Indrajit's original text, which I'm still begging. So if any of you are Sanskrit scholars, can one of you go and get it out and do a scholarly edition of it? Because it's still waiting to be done. And it was under a special restricted shelf mark called Phi, which a Bodleian, this is University of Oxford librarian, had tried to find all the dirty stuff in the Bodleian, and there were an awful lot of books in there, and he'd given them all a special shelf mark. So as soon as you type in or write that Phi, it triggers all kinds of sort of alarms, basically, and you have different procedures to do with logging out the book.
James and I wanted to leave a good chunk of time for questions from the audience, and it has been signaled to me that we have 20 minutes now to open it up to questions. So there is a mic going around somewhere. There are 2 mics, so if you draw the attention.
Hello. Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
You mentioned that you won't. Yeah. You mentioned that you won't leave your daughter's sexual education in the hands of a 15-year-old young boy. So could you give me a heads up of the conversation that you'll have with your daughter regarding the book and regarding the sexual education that you'll provide her?
That's a very uncomfortable question. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a very good question because, of course, I'm not immune from the same lack of comfort. I mean, I have become a lot more resistant to it. I actually forget sometimes that other people don't have quite the same lack of filters. So I remember having a conversation with my editor in a different book, in the Penguin offices in London, and I was starting to say, explaining the amazing way in which after ejaculation, the semen decoagulates in order to release the sperm, and it's this incredible biological. And I suddenly realised that the entire office had gone silent, and my filters had I'd forgotten them. But when I'm in the presence of my children, I have to be a bit careful. I hope that I'll be big enough just to be proud of having written sincerely, openly about the subject, and I hope that is the best answer. My fear, of course, is that we do have shame and embarrassment in all societies in the world, and there will be a difficult moment when some ghastly little brat comes dancing up to one of my daughters and says, "Your daddy wrote a dirty book," and I don't know. What do I do? Help me.
I'd like to ask, what was the inspiration for this research of yours? And secondly, when you were writing the book, did you think about the narrative? Would it just be like a historical journey, or did you want to make it more humorous and light and not too serious?
Another fantastic question. So there were two parts: my inspiration and how I treated it. My inspiration was I was living in Nepal, and I was teaching some younger people, Nepali students. And at the end of the course, they gave me an illustrated copy of the Kama Sutra. It was a joke. We all laughed. It was all fine. And then I started looking at it, and I couldn't work it out. I thought, what is this? I knew enough to know that the pictures were fundamentally of Persian origin, Mughal era, and I knew the text was much older, and it seemed to be talking about an entirely different world. I thought there's something odd here. And then I was having a conversation with another editor who said, I'm thinking about doing books about a series about books that changed the world. Can you just tell me, is there anything about the Kama Sutra? So I started to go, Richard Burton, things I'd found out after having these unanswered questions. And it was the easiest book commission I've ever had. He just went, write the book. Because the story was there. And that takes me to the second part of your question. It is a narrative. I have 7 chapters which aim to mirror the 7 books of the original Kama Sutra. They are chronological, although each chapter also has a different theme. And the basis of the book is as scholarly as I could make it, relying heavily on the work of real scholars at the coalface, like Professor Dehejia here. But also I thought, if you write about sex without acknowledging the embarrassment, without laughing, like the thing about the cries of the duck, goose, and pigeon, without laughter, the embarrassment wins. So I tried to also have moments of levity. I hope that answers the question. We've mentioned my daughters. Will you allow me one moment? Peter Frankopan asked if he could take a little 2-second video clip of the audience, because his daughters would never believe that their daddy could possibly have had so many people listening to him. I would love to do the same. Will you allow me just to do that and maybe give a cheer? Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So excited. I'm so excited to be here.
Hi.
Hello.
You said that the Kama Sutra is about the objectification of women. I mean, it's something that we can't deny, that there is objectification of women in the Kama Sutra. But do you think that there's some objectification of the man as well? I mean, like as a love machine who has to perform. And do men, feel threatened sometimes by this kind of element in the Kama Sutra?
Do you want to respond?
No.
I think it's a brilliant question, partly because the the honest answer is yes, and I hadn't thought of it. Yes. However, the kind of man described, the man about town, the Nagaraka, is an idealized type already. He exists as a sort of cipher, as an ideal, as a mode of being which extremely wealthy apart from anything else. So I think there's a slight difference in the power relations. To objectify somebody extremely powerful is very different than if you objectify somebody who is weak and vulnerable who you can exploit. That's the best answer I could make, but I think you're absolutely right.
I was wondering whether the book is, did the author write the book in the sense that this is it, like this is the ultimate...
Sorry, can you speak a bit louder? I couldn't quite catch that.
Can you hear me? Did the author write the book in the sense that this is the ultimate book on sex, or is it something like a process that, and it is going to bring out so many other things about the human being?
Yeah, it's just the mic boom about the alphabet. I think it's again. Sorry, I'm not just flattering you willy-nilly. These are great questions. Yes, he's very conscious of constructing the authoritative word on sex. That this would compile all the wisdom that had his predecessors had come to, and that this would remain the authoritative ABC. And in fact, it is treated exactly in that way by many later writers who refer back to it as the authority. I mean, this is again something you know more about than I do.
Yes, the tradition of texts like that continues, but every one of the later authors refers back to Vatsyayana as the original sort of ur-text. It becomes that.
And I think that's really interesting from a Western perspective as well, because there are, of course, as Carrie Vout was saying, lots of wealth of erotic material from classical Greece and Rome in Latin and Greek. But there isn't quite the single scientific description. You know, there's a lot of kind of satirical poetry. There's, I'm looking at one of the great authorities as I'm speaking, and I'm thinking I should really backpedal here. But it does have this particular status, almost like, not an alphabet, but a Bible, if I can use that word.
If I may intervene for a moment, one aspect you haven't spoken about, same-sex love.
Yes, again, excellent. Yes. The Kama Sutra mentions same-sex love, but we have to, before we discuss this, immediately forget or try to push aside every understanding that we might have from our culture of what it is to be a man who has sex with a man or a gay man. Those categories just don't exist. What Vatsyayana describes are many kinds of men who have sex with men, but always in specific contexts. And interestingly, so the man about town can absolutely have sex with a man. He says at one point, good friends, when they really trust each other, two men, that they'll sometimes do oral sex. Quite, just what, why wouldn't you, is the sort of feeling that comes from the text. He also describes men who have sex with basically their social inferiors. So you can have sex with two kinds of men who are described as she, not he, because that is their role. One is a kind of masseur, but basically there's a butch and a femme. One is a sort of ladyboy, and one is a big guy who'll give you a massage and a happy ending, to put it in a modern cultural context. So there is certainly men who have sex with men in the Kama Sutra, but it is of a specific kind. So there's a French scholar, Alain Danielou, who translated the book into French, and he's an extraordinary figure. I talk about him in my book. But he tried to use the Kama Sutra for gay rights in the same way that Richard Burton and Arbuthnot had used it for sexual openness and for women. He tried to say, look, here's a text in which gay sex is absolutely central and important and accepted. It's not quite true.
Yep.
Hi. First of all, I have to say that this is one talk which has had...
Can you speak into the mic, please?
This has been the one talk which has had my full attention. I would, I would like to ask you, what do you think has been the effect of British on the Indian sexual behavior?
Okay, that's the worst question of the entire review. All the other questions were great. That one's a nightmare. Is the one thing I said, whatever you do, James, don't start talking about that issue. You'll get hung. And I was also told not to read aloud from page 87, but if you want to know about that, there's another issue. I think it is very easy, as easy in India, to blame the British Victorians for sexual conservatism as it is easy for me in modern Britain to blame the Victorians for sexual conservatism. It's true up to a point, but not nearly as true as we like to make it. A lot of the myths about Victorian sexual attitudes were created by the Edwardians. I don't know how many of you have heard the idea that the Victorians were so appalled by a table leg that they had little skirts. Has anyone heard that thing? Right, yeah. It's nonsense. It's not true. Someone very diligent went round and actually kind of checked, you know, in all artworks and everything, and then they found, you know, the Edwardians, like naughty children all around the world, like to blame their parents for being fussy and old-fashioned and prudish. However, Vidya mentioned how the British appropriated the laws of Manu and turned it into the kind of centerpiece of the Indian penal code. Now, that was pretty much a British decision. I mean, it would have been influenced by many forces. But I don't think you can blame the British entirely. You know, conservatism, sexual asceticism, sexual conservatism, aggression towards sex, misogyny are as implicit in ancient Indian, medieval Indian culture as in ancient and medieval cultures all over the world. It's not just our fault.
Yeah. Okay. I've got a question here. Right here. Hi, James. Right here.
Hello
Good evening.
Hi.
I've got a basic question here that I'm sure your book, for your book, you've done extensive research into putting India into context. Is there something fundamentally wrong with our society, all culture, because sex is considered to be a huge taboo? People generally don't discuss it openly, or even if a sexual related, let's say a condom ad comes on a TV, people try to just look here and there or change the TV channel. And still we have 1.3 billion. So, so is there something fundamentally wrong maybe with the way our upbringing is there or lack of education? What's your views on that?
Okay, if you think I'm going to come to India and say what's wrong with Indian sexual culture, I'm not suicidal. No, there is a serious point here. I don't think it's any accident that most cultures I've ever encountered have many taboos around sexuality and sex, and India is no exception. It is a highly politicized issue in India at the moment. But, you know, there is this... People from India tell me all the time, oh, you know, you just don't quite understand quite how strong these taboos are. All I know is when I look around India now, I see those taboos being broken all the time. You know, posters, TV, it is there. But like in the Kama Sutra, like in every other society, these are competing counter-currents. And I suppose if you believe, as I do, that the greatest kind of issue of our time is feminism, and if you think that the best way to protect men and women from unequal sexual relations is to be open and to speak honestly, then I think there's something wrong with every culture that fails to do that, because it's bad parenting.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. My question is that you spoke about gay sex, sex between same gender, and you also spoke intermittently about the Indian Penal Code. Now, gay sex is still something which is not legal in this country. But during your research, what was it that you came out with? I mean, do you actually believe that this is something which actually prevails? I mean, are the instincts really natural? Because some people have mentioned gay sex as something which is unnatural. So what has your research been able to find out so far, if anything, on this?
It's again a really
Very
interesting,
tough question.
tough question. Okay, I think the word natural and unnatural is unfortunate because the categories, natural and unnatural, are socio-political categories.
That's a quotes.
Yeah, but the underlying biology, I think there's absolutely no doubt anymore that biologically, sex between men exists in the world just as much as sex between men and women. I think you would, on the evidence we now have pouring out of biology, of cross-cultural studies of sexual behavior, this exists. You know, you cannot deny that it exists. So the question is, how do you respond to that? And the reasons that people want to penalise sex between men have nothing to do with biology and usually have many other pressures upon them. So for me, even thinking about it as a natural is a bit unfortunate. And of course, I think any legal system that criminalises private behaviour, especially against the most profound scientific and social evidence, is not a compassionate legal system. I would put it more strongly, and I'm sure you know.
If I may add to that, in the visual record and in the literary record, I've also come across a number of instances of love between two women. You could go to the caves at Karle, the Buddhist caves at Karle, and when you walk in, the capitals of all of them they have elephants and a couple on top. And if you look carefully, you will see two women among them too. There's also the poetic corpus, in which a woman is addressing another woman and saying, I love the touch of your hands on my breast. You know, those sort of poems. So there is same-sex love between women as well, which was obviously another natural or a biological instinct.
And it's sex between women is mentioned in the Kama Sutra as well. It doesn't make a big deal about it because the focus is on the man as the primary sexual agent, but it is recognized.
Hi, James. My question is, there's a thin line between erotica and pornography. So as an author, how do you maintain that thin line? And, you know, for a book like Kama Sutra, so it doesn't look like that. So yeah. How do you maintain that line between?
You know, before you answer that, it's a very tedious text to read. It really is tedious reading. You should try reading it, and then the pornography comes in when they start illustrating it, more or less. But you may have a different...
I happen to love it. I think it has moments of beauty. But yes, it is a minute description of you know, how a man colours his teeth and things. Where at a certain point you think, oh. I would say it's not a thin line between erotica and pornography. It's more of a sort of fat hinterland. There's no frontier. In my own work, I suppose the definition of pornography is it is designed primarily to produce a sexual reaction. And I'm afraid if you buy my book seeking to be aroused, you will be sadly disappointed. So I suppose it's about the intention and about the effect. And the effect of my book is not arousing. It may be shocking. I hope it's very shocking. I'll tell you one brief story if I have a moment. I have a dear friend who has a very... Yeah, everyone's got an auntie who's your sort of beloved. You're not your actual aunt, but your friend's mother or aunt. This woman I really like and admire, and she's very clever. And my friend Charlie went bounding up to her and said, "Oh, my friend James just published a book. You'll be so pleased because I know you two are really close." And she said, "Oh, Charlie, yes, show me." And she opened the book, and it fell open on the one page, which is literally unspeakable. I mean, I cannot read it on the stage. It is the single most offensive thing I've ever read, and I'm quoting. So yes, there are moments in the book where I take a risk, but it is a strategic risk, and I am quoting with a purpose to show how this group of British Victorian men who printed the Kama Sutra privately in 1883, how they delighted not only in serious political concerns, but how they loved to shock. So if you're going to shock, shock as much as possible.
We can take just one more question.
Hi, James. Hi.
Oh, hi. Yeah.
Hey.
Hello.
I mean, both of you have been mentioning some of the other texts that talk about the Kama Sutra. So I just wanted to know what happened to them, or are they not good enough to have gone as viral as the Kama Sutra?
It's a great question, which I'm not fully qualified to answer, as it's not really the focus of my book. Yeah, there are a number of texts which are sex manuals, which mention the Kama Sutra, medieval texts, mostly in Sanskrit, the ones I looked at. There's also a lot of poetry, Sanskrit poetry, which seems to reference the Kama Sutra, like some of the activities of people within the poems, or even the positions described are, in fact, there's one poem which explicitly says, it's really funny, it says, oh, you know, her bangles rung, you know, she moved in this way, and it starts describing this woman's sexual pleasure, and he says, oh yeah, but you don't need to know anymore, because it's just the rest of it is just like it described it in the Kama Sutra. So it kind of references it and uses it to avoid the problem. But yeah, lots of them were printed and published. In fact, the existence of the Kama Sutra in English, the 1883 one I keep referring to, exists because a 16th century Sanskrit text, known as the Ananga Ranga, was quite widely available. Burton himself found copies in Marathi, Gujarati, Sanskrit, Hindi, Hindustani as he referred to it. So it was widely translated. It's a much more recent text, and that's the one that mentions the Kama Sutra being the text, to use Vidya's word.
Not going into that, just one comment, because I know we're running out of time. The ruler, the monarch, the king, had to have a knowledge of love, had to have the experience of love, had to know how to balance the pursuit of love with the pursuit of ruling his empire. And the text, Dawood Ali has written some wonderful works on the subject, where love was something you experienced as a little battle, a lovely battle, and you had to know how to do that so that you knew, and you had to do it with more than one woman over your period of time, so that you knew how to battle with your various enemies, how to keep them, draw them into your control, how to let go of them, and how to treat them. So that's just another aside of how important the game of love was in that sort of culture of the medieval. I don't like the term medieval, I don't know what to use in its place, but in that early sort of Indian context. And I'm being told that it is time. James, thank you so much for being with us this evening. And
thank you, it's been an honor and a privilege.